skill, strengthening the earth level 1. The hamster rolled over on its back and began to compact the soil. Peapodong skill, puffing out its cheeks level 1. The animal puffed out its cheeks and spat out a boulder. The stone plopped down in front of the hero. The young man smiled and was glad that the problem with the heavy equipment was solved. Lloyd walked down the corridor, his hands in his pockets. He wondered if people would be suspicious if the guy suddenly showed up with this magical creature. The hero grinned and decided that he would carry a summoning book with him and tell everyone that he was a genius summoner. The nobleman looked ahead and remembered that it was time to solve the problem with workers for a large-scale construction project. The next day, the young man stood in front of a group of people with shovels and ordered them to repeat after him. He squeezed the handle of the tool and shouted that safety was above all. The 30-man Frontera barony army looked at the gentleman absent-mindedly and sluggishly repeated the phrase. The brown-haired man smiled tensely and thought that these guys looked like soldiers who were paid but did not work. He was surprised that they had not been dispersed yet, considering that the baron had a lot of debt. The boy smiled and pointed out that that was why they wouldn't get any overtime bonuses. It was good that they had manpower. Lloyd frowned and shouted that they were soldiers, and when they got together, they were an army. The hero threw his shovel over his shoulder and said that their essence was to complete tasks. The young man remembered that when he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than trading. The nobleman pointed to a pile of earth and said that he dug it up after working all night. In fact, Peapodong dug it all up in half an hour. The brown-haired man put his hand on his belt and shouted that the first task was to revive the estate. This was a boiler room project for the people of the estate. To make it, the soldiers had to move the earth to the construction site. The men looked at the master with disappointment. The hero had expected them to react like that. Someone came up behind him and called out. The senior knight of the Newman barony looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he had ordered his men to do. Lloyd smirked and thought that he had expected the man to speak up. There were 3 knights in this estate: Newman, his subordinate Bairn, and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Asrahan. At the beginning of the novel, only Bairn and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. The senior knight looked at the boy with displeasure. It was this man who had been the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who had sold information about the Baron to swindlers, he owed a hefty debt. The hero looked at the swordsman with disdain and wondered how such a man could even be the senior knight. The young man looked at his interlocutor with a grin and asked him what he thought they were doing. The man frowned and said that he could not believe that an aristocrat was forcing the militia to do dirty work. He added that, as the head of the knights, he could not tolerate this. The guy leaned on the shovel and thought it was nonsense, because the hero was earning money to pay off his debts. He said that he had obtained the baron's permission. The knight stood opposite the aristocrat. Newman said that he did not know how the young man had outwitted his lord, but offered to recall the young master's past. The man frowned and suggested that his interlocutor was using the militia forces for personal gain. The brown-haired man closed his eyes, then smiled and replied that he was right. The hero glared menacingly at the swordsman and warned that he would get it now. The warrior's face instantly distorted with anger and irritation. Just think about his weak self-control. If the knight had tried to play an online game, he would have exploded in a minute. Lloyd pulled the tool out of the ground and, swinging, threw sand at his interlocutor. The soldiers stared at them in shock. The man covered his eyes with his hand in displeasure, and the brown-haired man only grinned. The swordsman was shaking with anger. He looked at the young man angrily and was indignant that he had really tried to tarnish the knight's reputation. In his mind, Newman called him the stupid son of a nearly bankrupt baron. The hero put his hand to his ear and asked if his interlocutor really wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy swung his shovel and pointed it at the warrior. Lloyd smiled and suggested a duel. The flushed man raised his eyebrows and warned that the young man would regret it. Frontera Estate. The hero was going to duel Newman in a month. Xavier looked at the gentleman and asked if he was so sure of his victory. The aristocrat was sitting on the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at the knight and exclaimed that he was not. The boy added that his opponent was a knight called the Heart of Mana and a junior sword expert, and he himself was just a lazybones. Naturally, he was not up to fighting him. The young man asked if the other man had even thought about it before asking such a question. Xavier frowned in irritation and squeezed the hilt of his sword. Then the warrior loosened his grip and noted that he had almost cut down the gentleman. He looked at the hero picking his nose and could not believe that he had suddenly thrown dirt at the Newman knight and even asked for a duel. Perhaps the young man wanted to be a scoundrel again. However, the boy himself asked the baron for a favor, then entered into an argument and pushed Xavier away. By this time, he had appointed Knight Baron as a temporary manager and was in charge of the construction team. However, the young man was unsure about this duel. The brown-haired man pulled a booger out of his nose, and the other man immediately wanted to hack him to death. The hero wiped his hands and said that the knight had to do something. The young man smiled and asked to be taught how to handle a sword. The other man frowned and said that he did not want to. The aristocrat looked at him with disappointment and asked why. The swordsman replied that, first of all, it was his duty to protect the young master. The blonde man looked calmly at Lloyd and added that he was like a sack, and if a sack learned fencing, it would be even more dangerous to be around him. The aristocrat asked to at least speak more softly. The brown-haired man once again clarified whether the knight really did not want to teach him. The hero smiled confidently and said that he would deal with his insomnia in exchange. Xavier looked at the gentleman in shock, not understanding how he knew about it. The young man grinned and thought that, thanks to the novel, he also knew the reason for his insomnia. In the work The Knight of Iron and Blood, knights are divided into 4 levels by rank: Sword Master, Supreme Sword Expert, Middle Sword Expert, Junior Sword Expert. Xavier's level is Supreme Sword Expert, and he will soon become a Master Sword Master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called Sword Master Syndrome. The brown-haired man leaned on his hands and thought that in the countryside they do not know such things, so the knight himself does not know either. The hero looked at his interlocutor and asked if he agreed to the deal, because it was written on his face that he had insomnia. Xavier sighed and replied that he would try. The nobleman smiled and asked him not to give in to him. The swordsman chuckled and said that he was saying this because the young man would definitely fail. He had tried many things to cure his insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, exercise, oriental medicine, and the like. The knight was sleeping peacefully in a chair, hugging a pillow. The protagonist stood in front of him and chuckled that he knew exactly how to cure insomnia. The 18th magic technique is reading a manual on reinforced concrete structures. This is what puts you to sleep. The guy grinned and thought that all the swordsman's skills would now be his. The sun was shining in the sky. The refreshed and well-rested knight looked at the master and ordered him to run 50 laps. The hero looked at the warrior in surprise and turned around and ran. The swordsman turned to look at the master and was amazed that he ran without complaint. Lloyd was running circles around the training ground. He ran up to the knight and muttered in a tired voice that he hated it and was eager to learn something. After these words, the guy ran on. Having completed the next circle, the hero smiled at his interlocutor and asked if he expected that the aristocrat would not be able to and would whine. The warrior continued to watch the gentleman running circles. At the next turn, the sweaty guy exclaimed that the knight would have simply said that the young man was not cut out for it and waved him off. Xavier shuddered, because the interlocutor guessed right. The brown-haired man ran on with a laugh, shouting that he would run to the end. Notification: passive skill ugliness increased to level 4. Anyone who sees you will take you for a freak and will feel the desire to punch you. The young man got angry and exclaimed that he did not have such a skill. The hero was sweating and breathing heavily. It would be a lie to say that he was not tired. However, this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning the boy opened his eyes in a crowded Gishiwan. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night the boy loaded trucks with boxes just to not die of hunger, always dreaming that someday it would get better. The young man encouraged himself that he was doing well, was qualified, and there was still a little bit left. But the light he was reaching for suddenly went out, and the hero was left alone with the darkness. Compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Lloyd ran under the moonlight and smiled. The knight continued to stand nearby. He looked closely at the master and thought that he would teach him his fencing technique if the aristocrat was so sincere. The brown-haired man continued to turn circles. Notification: Xavier's opinion of you has increased by +1. His opinion of you is -28. You have received 18 RP for slightly improving your relationship with a key character. Score: 29 RP. The manor was illuminated by the moon. The Baron sat at the table and looked at Newman standing in front of him. The man could not believe that his son would be so rude to the one who had protected their family for 5 generations. Arcus leaned on his hands and muttered that he thought the boy had come to his senses, but he must have misunderstood him. He looked at the swordsman and said that it was his moral duty not to interfere with the duel. Still, the Baron asked him not to be too cruel to the heir to the estate. The Lord looked at his interlocutor intently and ordered that the boy be brought to his senses, but not crippled. Newman bowed and accepted the request. The knight smirked and thought that he did not know if he could do it during the duel. He walked down the corridor, determined to kill this arrogant bastard. And if the Baron made a big deal out of it, he would destroy him and the Baroness too and pass it off as suicide. The swordsman smiled and thought that, as planned, he would then leave this village for a better place. Thanks to the young master, his plan was coming to fruition faster than he expected. A month passed. Spectators gathered around the training ground to watch the nobleman and the knight standing opposite each other. The protagonist's parents were sitting under the canopy, looking nervous, while Xavier and Baron stood behind them. The man raised his sword and asked if his opponent was ready. The boy took a step forward and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, answered in the affirmative. He smiled confidently and advised his opponent to get ready to rake in the dirt. While the young man stood there grinning, the people around him were discussing the fact that the gentleman would be fighting Newman with a shovel. The blonde gritted his teeth in anger. Xavier looked down at the hero and noticed that the metal shovel had been ordered from a blacksmith. Arcus covered his face with his hand and muttered that his son was an idiot who thought this was some kind of joke. The knight looked at the sight carefully and thought that if he remembered what the young man had been doing for the past month, it might not be a joke. The gentleman did general exercises early in the morning without complaining, then went to the construction site to explain the boiler room to the village engineers, and after that, trained with a sword until he wanted to sleep. This did not look like a man who was just joking. Xavier frowned, sure that the young gentleman was serious. The Baron raised his hand and announced that the duel between Lloyd Frontera and the knight Newman was about to begin. The man took a fighting stance, and the boy grabbed the shovel with a grin. Xavier frowned, not understanding what kind of stupid stance this was. The blonde attacked first, outraged by his opponent's behavior. The brown-haired man swung the shovel and easily blocked his opponent's blow. The father and the swordsman standing behind him stared at the duelists in surprise. Newman swung again and thought that the young man would not be lucky a second time. However, this attack was also blocked by the young gentleman. Xavier's eyes widened and he realized that this incredible and effective technique was used in real battles, as if his swordsmanship had suddenly improved after so many years. The opponent began to sweat and looked warily at Lloyd. The young man grinned and thought that there was nothing surprising in this, because in Korea every man could do this. This is a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. He lunged with the shovel, and the opponent recoiled in fear. The hero covered himself with the tool, using it as a shield. Then he made another lunge with the tip, but the man dodged. The young man thrust the weapon into the ground and, laughing, began to jump on it. Xavier sweated and wondered if the aristocrat was really joking. The sweaty guy continued to laugh, but his gaze remained confident. The watching knight tried to understand his plan. Newman ran up to attack with a cry. The brown-haired man took a fighting stance and thought that the first thing he had prepared for the enemy was a shovel, and the second was the basic fencing that Xavier had taught him. The young man fought off the attacks and gradually pushed the enemy back. The man clenched his teeth in irritation, not understanding when the drunkard and scum had become so strong. The third thing the hero had prepared was this, a synchronized skill for handling a tool. Digging, level 1. Become one with the shovel, body and soul. The level of synchronization between you and your shovel will increase. The guy swung, and his tool began to glow. Xavier's opinion of the hero increased by +1 during the training. And the Baron and Baroness, who saw their son's sincerity for the first time in their lives, had it increased by +2 and +3. They accumulated 97 RP, which allowed them to purchase an additional skill for 40 points. Then the hero realized that he had learned a pretty cool skill. He looked closely at his opponent. The man exhaled and swung his sword. Newman thought that he had no choice. It was unlikely that this should be used against an ordinary person, but he wanted to. A glow began to emanate from his body. Xavier narrowed his eyes. The enemy was pumping up mana. The brown-haired man frowned, realizing this. The enemy was about to use a mana heart. The mustachioed man grabbed the handle and, frowning, declared that now everything was serious. The young man did not answer, and the opponent rushed at him. The knight watching them frowned and thought that someone who had not had any talents for 10 years, even the most ordinary ones, would need at least 5 years to master the mana heart. The young master would not be able to block such an attack. The man swung his blade. The boy held the shovel in front of him, but the enemy only grinned, confident that he would cut it in half and break the aristocrat's skull. The protagonist's parents jerked in horror, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands. The blow hit the shovel, but it did not flinch. Newman stared ahead in shock. He felt like all his strength was leaking out. Lloyd smirked and thought that this was the fourth skill he had prepared, Mana Mastery, which made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. The knight watched the duel closely. Mana flowed into the boy's body through the weapon. This was the technique of the Asrahan core. The man recoiled in fear and exclaimed that his mana had been drained. At that moment, the hero swung and hit his opponent in the face with a shovel. A broken tooth flew against the blue sky, which its owner looked at sadly. Lloyd's next blow was to the chin with the opposite end of the tool. The boy looked down at the swordsman with an ominous look and hit him hard on the head. Newman fell flat on the ground at his feet. All the spectators widened their eyes in shock. They saw the knight lying in front of the boy, but they could not believe that the young master had won. Arcus raised his hand in confusion and announced that Lloyd Frontera had won the duel. The blonde was lying on the ground and did not understand how such a master of the sword could lose to the scum. The aristocrat came closer and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, said that the man had been beaten. The hero swung and said that it was time for the long-awaited punishment. The man looked up in fear. The Baron jumped up and shouted that the duel was already over. The young man began to beat the enemy with a shovel. Arcus frowned and shouted his son's name in rage. The knights immediately began to hold the protagonist so that he would stop hitting Newman with a shovel. Bayern stood next to Xavier at this time and looked at what was happening with an angry expression, suggesting that the protagonist had gone crazy. At this time, Xavier looked ahead with sadness and realized that Lloyd could have lost his mind. The protagonist at this time waved his hands and sighed heavily, because he ordered to let him go because he had calmed down. Then he put the shovel on the ground and his hands on his belt, sighing with relief. Then he started hitting his opponent with the shovel again and they tried to restrain him again. Xavier looked through his bangs with displeasure and realized, if you look closely, he was hitting him so as not to hurt him too much. At this time, the blonde with a mustache screamed from the blows. The brown-haired man at this time looked at his opponent angrily, but Xavier saw this calm expression on his face because he seemed to know in advance what would happen next and as if he already knew everything. At this time, the guy with blue hair looked ahead coldly. In his memories, 15 days before the duel, the brown-haired man leaned his hand on the blade and wanted to learn the Azarakan technique of the mind. At that moment, Xavier looked at him in surprise, and the brown-haired man did not understand such a reaction because he asked to teach him something good and not stealing. It was a silhouette of a man who absorbed the aura streams, because in addition to the assimilated mana, it can attract mana from what surrounds him and transform it into his mana. At that moment, the knight looked at him intently and asked the master how he knew this, because he understood that he had always kept this technique a secret because it was still not complete. Lloyd looked at his teacher with wide eyes and said that he helped him fall asleep, and Xavier talked about it in his sleep.